So governments need to have a lot of power to deal with the fallout from public health crises, epidemics, pandemics, and so forth. I mean, those powers are necessary. What could go wrong? Today, we're going to have a conversation with Christopher J. Coyne on that subject. And let me welcome everybody who is joining us far and near, also to our friends on ThinkSpot in particular, to a conversation coming to you from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. We are located a stone's throw from San Francisco and near Silicon Valley. We think we are in a position to give an unusual and independent take on many of the issues of the day. So today I'm welcoming Christopher J. Coyne. Professor Coyne is a professor of economics at George Mason University. Am I right about that, Chris?
Yes, you are.
And you have recently published a really fascinating piece, which is forthcoming in our journal called the Independent Review, Infectious Diseases and Government Growth. I printed off a copy of it from our own website, which is independent.org, Infectious Diseases and Government Growth. I encourage everybody to take a peek at it there. We kind of pre-published it for you, Chris, before the actual paper journal comes out because it's so salient. And we kind of in-house gave it the unofficial slogan of virus and Leviathan, because you're telling us about the ways in which government power grows intentionally and unintentionally. Tell us first about also your two co-authors.
Certainly. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. And so this piece is co-authored with Nathan Goodman, who is a PhD student at George Mason University in economics. He's finishing up his dissertation right now. And Abigail Devereaux, who is an assistant professor of economics at Wichita State University. And these are just two fabulous young scholars. They're superstars already, and I feel fortunate to work with them on this project and other work as well.
But you must have gotten started on the research for this long before pandemics were the rage.
Certainly. And so, I've long been influenced by the economic historian Bob Higgs, whose work was on many topics, but one of them was on government growth during times of crises. And so that's something that has interested me now for the 2 decades of my own career. And this is one manifestation of that logic.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. I mean, just to give our friends the basic thesis here, I'm reading from the first little bit that you provided here. Governments around the world, in response to the current pandemic, have adopted a variety of policies expanding the scope of their power. Some of these effects are immediate and observable. Others, however, are not readily observable and appear only over time. So you're giving us this isn't just about the current stuff, is it?
No, not at all. And so there's a tendency, to the extent people pay attention to what government is doing at all, they usually focus on the here and now. What can I see? What are they spending? What activities are they taking? That's important. We don't in any way, shape, or form intend to dismiss that. But the point we're trying to kind of highlight and hopefully impress upon people is that there are also these long-term consequences to government action. Oftentimes they are long and variable, meaning they can't be fully anticipated or known at the time of action. And they can do significant harm over significant periods of time. And in some cases, they can fundamentally change the fabric of domestic life in ways that I think many people would find undesirable.
I like the international or comparative focus that is kind of laced through this paper. I noticed at the beginning you mentioned that some of the current things that are worrisome are going on elsewhere, not just in the United States, but you mentioned, for example, that in Poland and Russia, some of the public officials there have used the pandemic as a justification to change rules about elections, put their allies in key judicial positions, silence critical media coverage. It just seems like they're using the pandemic as a good excuse for what they really wanted to do in the first place. But what I'm getting from your paper, Chris, is that actually the harmful expansion of government power in response to health crises like this, it doesn't require there to be an ill intent. I mean, maybe the people in Poland and Russia are kind of nefarious, but surely in the United States, we don't have an ill intent, and yet there's these long-term things, right?
Certainly. And so, the logic underpinning this does not require any kind of nefarious motivation, as you correctly point out. It can be by the initial actors or by subsequent actors, and so I also don't want to dismiss that. But the theoretical logic does not require that. It is, in some sense, one of the logical outcomes or logical possibilities of expanding the discretionary power that is granted to government.
A lot of people feel that bad things only happen when bad things are intended. But as an economist, I think you tell us a lot about unintended consequences, don't you?
That's certainly true. So going back to Frederick Bastiat and, of course, the great Henry Hazlitt, who in Economics in One Lesson wrote that the art of economics is not just focusing on the here and now and the scene, but the chain of consequences that kind of unravel from some kind of initial intervention into a system.
Yeah. So what I was thinking we might do, Chris, is come back to some of those theoretical points, because the paper is both empirical and theoretical, both historical and theoretical. And the themes that you mentioned that you have in common with Bob Higgs we need to come back to those. But let's talk a little bit about these three interesting historical cases where governments responded to health crises in ways that really had a lot of consequences. The first one had to do with South Africa, right? And what you call the Sanitation Syndrome, 1901. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yep. So we're talking about around 1900, and we're talking about the plague in Cape Town and the resulting policies of apartheid. And so you mentioned Sanitation Syndrome, and what that is, it's a belief, an erroneous belief, but a belief that conflates certain characteristics, typically minority, racial, and ethnic characteristics, with the communication of disease, so the spread of disease, meaning that it is believed that certain groups are responsible for the spread of disease to the wider community. And that logic is illustrated quite well by the 1901 Cape Town plague. And so
what kind of sickness was the plague at that point?
The bubonic plague. This is what we're talking about. And so there's scientists don't have and historians don't have a perfect understanding of the origins of it. They think that it came in with fodder for British troops' horses that was imported in, that led to that. But we don't know.
But that was in connection with the so-called Boer War?
Yep, that's exactly right. So the South African War, or the Boer War. And what that was the British government fighting against multiple independent states, or Boer states as they were known. And the British ultimately won that war and ended up incorporating the states into the British Empire. But for the purpose of what I want to discuss is that you get the spread of the plague, and that the British were quick to place the blame for the origins of the plague on the slums and those that were living in it, and specifically Africans.
You mentioned that this guy who was the medical officer for Cape Town, John Gregory, called the African residential areas scattered nests of filth.
That's right. That's right. And so that's the kind of rhetoric that was built up around the Sanitation Syndrome. Is that these slums and the people that live within them they're literally filth, and they're the cause of this. And so to skip over a lot of nuance, but to get to the main point, what happens is that thousands of Africans were forcibly removed from their homes and moved to a farm that was really kind of a place where sewage was placed, and forced to live in these terrible conditions. And so, of course, that affected the people living there in a terrible way. But it also had long-term consequences. And here's where the unseen that you and I were talking about earlier comes into play.
So the plague subsided, but
eventually, yes, certainly. And so soon the British and British officials, who, as I mentioned, they won the war. There was still some guerrilla kind of pushback, but for all intents and purposes, the British won. They became active proponents of maintaining the segregation. And one of the, if not the main arguments for the legislation enacting the compulsory race-based segregation was the fear that Africans would spread infectious disease. And so they needed to be kept separate. This is one of the main motivations and justifications between apartheid. And so come back to what we were discussing earlier, you get a mix of a kind of crisis, the plague situation,
Hmm.
an institutional context where you had colonialism, you had a government that had significant discretionary power. You mix in an ideology of racism, and you can see how a government intervention to address an infectious disease had severe costs, both in the immediate term, that is, the people that were forcibly removed from their homes and forced to live in misery, as well as long-term consequences on the social fabric of African society. And so that's kind of illustrates at a high level what you and I were discussing earlier.
So there's kind of a straight line from the hysteria over the plague in Cape Town in 1901, and then the powers that the state there acquired and the patterns that they begun practicing, straight line from that into apartheid.
There's certainly a connection, yes.
Wow. Okay, well, okay, my first reaction to that as a, well-intentioned American is, well, those people in South Africa, of course they were so bad, but our CDC, our health officials in the United States, our public officials wouldn't do that, would they? Okay, so this brings us to case history number 2, which has to do with the seamy background of zoning and urban planning.
Right. So our now we move from abroad to, as you said, our own backyard in America, and so modern zoning, we kind of take zoning for granted now. It's a part of American life.
Yeah, like residential houses are here, stores
Yeah,
are here,
yep.
freeways go between them.
Exactly, and you have to, in order to use a piece of property for a certain use, whether it's private or business, you have to get it approved for, by the appropriate zoning boards and whatnot. And so modern zoning, again, it's not the only cause, but it was heavily influenced by things like cholera, typhoid, smallpox, tuberculosis, and similar epidemics, and they were used as progressive era justifications for zoning and urban planning. I mean, urban planning is the idea that you can use human reason to design how people live, how people operate their businesses, how they live their life in a way that kind of maximizes the well-being of society as a whole.
Well, if you have the expertise to know what would make everyone perfectly happy and healthy, then you should just use the expertise, right?
That's right. That's right. Now, and then of course, the question is, do you have the expertise?
Right.
And when you grant people the power to use their supposed expertise, what are they going to do with it? Which segues nicely into the rest of this case, which is, during the second industrial revolution, so what's that, late 1800s into the 1900s, there was a movement called the City Beautiful movement, and this was a movement by middle class, upper class people to kind of design cities to get rid of the undesirable features, the undesirable people, and to make them beautiful, to have monuments and grandiose buildings and all this. And a lot of this, the justification for this was based on sanitation concerns. And so linking back to what we just discussed, it wasn't just sanitation concerns, but also the concerns of sanitation as it related typically to immigrant and poor populations who tended to live in high density areas, who tended to live in cheaper housing. And they were oftentimes held up as kind of the incubators and in today's terms, the super spreaders of infectious disease. And so,
because there were very successive waves of disease which spread through American cities in that time, right?
Certainly, and again, there was it was attributed to people being either poor or immigrants, and it's not to deny that these things happened, but there were other causes, like, for instance, putting water that people drank by outhouses. Is one example, and so that has nothing to do with someone being an immigrant. That's something else. In any case, related to this, there was this belief called miasma theory, and miasma theory is this belief that bad air from particles of decomposing matter was the cause of epidemics, and so you got this kind of rotting, decomposing matter that floated in particles in the air, and if people breathed it in, it would give them it would cause them to get sick. Of course, this has since been disproven, but it was a dominant view at the time. And so again, you can see why people said, as you were saying earlier, well, look, we have this problem. We know it's because of certain groups of people who are kind of contributing to this bad air. So we just use our expertise to fix it. That was the logic.
Relocate, redesign.
Exactly. And so you got the logical outcome of zoning, which was a progressive error move to de-densify
Hmm.
certain areas in order to prevent the spread of infectious disease. And the effect, of course, is that this made things more difficult for people that were already marginalized, who were
Mm,
already poor, and so on. It made housing more expensive.
right.
It moved residential areas away from businesses, so they weren't as accessible for certain people.
Which
And
separated families from income earning.
exactly correct. And so it had this reinforcement effect. And you see a connection between the segregation and uh, uh, race and ethnicity.
And
And
courts
so
got in on it because one of the things you mentioned was this U.S. Supreme Court case, Ambler Realty versus Village of Euclid.
that's right. And so
There
this
had
isn't.
been a lower court that said this new zoning was suspect because it was enforcing racial segregation, but no.
That's exactly correct. So this is a U.S. Supreme Court in 1926. As you said, it's Ambler Realty Company versus the Village of Euclid, which is in Ohio.
Hmm.
And to distill down a more nuanced case, but just in a few lines for the purposes of our conversation, the Realty Company owned something like 60 acres of land, and they wanted to use it to, part of it at least, for industrialization. And the Village of Euclid didn't want them to do it. So they said, no, you can't do this. We're taking your property and we're splitting it. We're zoning it and breaking into these different classes. And we're going to place limits on what you can do with it. And Ambler took the Village of Euclid to court. As you pointed out, a lower court found in favor of Ambler and explicitly said that the Village of Euclid was using this as a means of racial segregation. The case eventually went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court found in favor of the village and said that Ambler Realty had not demonstrated takings of their property. I mean, because they had not demonstrated that the zoning had actually reduced the value. They were forecasting that it would reduce the value, which did not demonstrate a violation of their due process and
And
takings.
they affirmed that the zoning originated with public health concerns.
That's correct. And so underpinning a lot of this again is a codification of government power. And you'll see
Mhm.
things like, well, things done in the public good or the public health are acceptable, constitutional, and legal. But very quickly you can see how that can expand over time. And so again, as we were discussing in the last case, eventually the various epidemics went away.
Mhm.
Epidemics have come and gone throughout human history, but the zoning laws, of course, have remained part of the fabric of American life, again, to varying degrees depending on the location, since that time. And again, it's not. I don't want to simplify the situation and attribute all zoning to these diseases, but they certainly played a role, and they certainly show how government responses to an infectious disease or infectious diseases can have long-lasting effects and set a precedent where governments can use the power that they obtain in subsequent periods for a variety of
Mhm.
reasons.
As you and your co-authors say at one point, many of the laws that exist today find their origins in responses to public health crises, and that some of these laws have outlived their initial justifications.
That's
So
correct.
the laws and the powers persist even though the justifications go away.
That's right.
Wow. Okay. So now let's go on to the third case, which, these things are getting a little bit more close to home the further we get into these historical studies. So now we're going to talk about compulsory vaccination, 1902. What health concern were they worried about in Massachusetts in 1902?
Okay, so we're around the same time, 1902, and as you point out, this one's a very powerful case because it really shows the breadth of what precedent of expanding government power can mean. And so in 1902, there was the smallpox epidemic, and in response to that, the Board of Health in Cambridge, Massachusetts, uh, produced an order that said all the people living in the area had to be vaccinated if they hadn't been vaccinated in the last 5 years, or pay a $5 fine. Now
So
you
it
say,
was going to be enforced.
yeah, exactly. And you say, well, $5, what's $5? I spend that on a cup of coffee. Well, you got to remember at the time, the average earnings were around $13 per week. And so that's a significant percentage of someone's income
I'll say,
at the time.
wow.
In any case, the key kind of person here that you need to recognize is a person named Pastor Henning Jacobson. And he was in his 40s. He was a Swedish immigrant. He lived in Cambridge, and he refused to be vaccinated. He had had a bad vaccination experience as a child, and he didn't want to get vaccinated. And he also refused to pay the fine after he was found guilty of violating the order. And so this led to a series of court cases. First, it went to the Massachusetts Supreme Court. It's called the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. And they ruled in favor, unanimously in favor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Well, not surprising, because after all, the Board of Health in Cambridge is just trying to keep everybody healthy.
That's right. So, they said, look, this was the law, and Jacobson clearly didn't follow it. And so through a series of appeals, the case was eventually brought to the U.S. Supreme Court. And what Jacobson's legal representation argued was that the Massachusetts legislature had deprived him of his liberty, of due process of law. So this was a case decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, and in a 7-2 opinion, they ruled in favor of Massachusetts. And they said that compulsory vaccination does not violate due process, doesn't violate the 14th Amendment. And so you say, okay.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah, and you say, look, they were enforcing public health. People should be vaccinated, and if it's stopped, and if that's all they're doing, what's the big deal?
And they weren't singling out Swedish pastors.
That's exactly right. It's not like they identified one immigrant group they were going after. So what's the issue? And you say, okay, well then you got to keep tracing out the consequences of this, which is that throughout subsequent periods, this case was used. And I literally mean used, cited, to justify an expansive array of government activities. And so, think about the progressive era. One of the characteristics or features of the progressive era was arguments by many supposed experts to rely on eugenics in order to kind of optimally design society. So
which of course was Margaret Sanger's approach to eugenics herself.
Yeah, certainly. And so the idea that I can, talk about who should reproduce, who shouldn't reproduce, what characteristics are optimal for society, and so on. Well, this case, the Jacobson versus Massachusetts case, which was 1905, was used repeatedly in order to justify this type of behavior of kind of centrally planning reproduction. And one kind of very stark example of this, it's a jarring example, but I think a very telling example, is a Supreme Court case in the 1920s, in 1927, called Buck versus Bell. And
notorious.
Yep, exactly. And by the way, so just to repeat for the chain, 1905 is Jacobson versus Massachusetts. Now we're in 1927. Okay, we're in Buck versus Bell. So you say, well, not a huge move, but still 2 decades later, this is going to come into play, and then we're going to keep going after that. So what happens? Well, the Supreme Court rules that state officials in Virginia can forcibly sterilize Carrie Buck on the grounds that she is feeble-minded. That she should not be able to reproduce. And I think very telling here is the majority opinion, which was written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. And I just want to read part of what he wrote, because I think it's very telling.
Yeah, do.
This is a quote from Holmes. Quote, "The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes," end quote. Okay, so now, unpack that. The logic or principle that sustains compulsory vaccination, remember it was just compulsory vaccination back in 1905 or earlier, now can be used for these purposes in the name of the public good, in the name of public health. He cited, by the way, Jacobson versus Massachusetts as his main precedent for making that ruling. Now, since then, that case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, has been cited numerous times. It's been cited in cases about law enforcement relying or utilizing warrantless entry in the name of enforcing public safety. Again, you get the public good. It's been brought up and referenced in the context of the war on terror, and whether you can detain people, U.S. citizens, as enemy combatants. It's been referenced in the context of issues of the random testing of students.
Mm.
So do schools have the ability or the legal right, I should say, not ability, the legal right to randomly test student athletes, for instance, for drugs? Or does that violate their right to privacy and their right to due process? And courts have upheld that they do have the right because it again fits with the schools and the public goal of reducing drug use in youth. And I think the main takeaway here, there's several, but one of them is when you say something like, well, government should be able to do X in the name of public health or public safety.
Which is
You have to,
sounds like a compelling reason.
and I could see why it would resonate with people, but you have to realize that those terms can be used in such a broad manner that it runs the risk of being used in an expansive way in future periods where the people that originally decided in the early 1900s in this case, probably in many of these cases couldn't have even fathomed it. They might have been able to fathom sterilization, but there's no way could have fathomed the war on terror or drug testing
Right.
student athletes. People in the early 1900s weren't thinking in those terms. And so what happens is you get these expansions of government power and they create institutional prerequisites, which in many cases sit there and sometimes they're used as we've discussed. In other cases, they sit there in a largely dormant matter, but then they're used decades later.
So,
I'm sorry, please, go ahead.
well, so for example, in this case we were talking about of Pastor Jacobson back in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So, one way of summarizing this, and this is probably way too provocative, but so there's this crazy anti-vaxxer who loses his case. Good thing he lost the case because he was a crazy anti-vaxxer. But it turns out that the precedent set to overcome this crazy anti-vaxxer was used then to justify warrantless searches, compulsory sterilization. Stunning.
Right. It's exactly right. And so, one of the main takeaways here is you can never just do one thing. It's never as simple as just, well, if government only did X, things would be better. That again has direct immediate effects, but these long-term consequences as well, which again all trace back to expanding the discretionary power that is granted to the state.
What strikes me in this is that a lot of the sort of misunderstanding comes from imagining the state the way you would think of an individual. So, I could imagine in my own thinking and my own decision making, I could distinguish between a situation where in an emergency of public health, I might want to mandate certain things. And then when the crisis is over, I'd withdraw the mandate because I could distinguish between the original crisis and the later use because I'm not stupid. But the state is not an individual mind. The state is a phenomenon of multiple actors acting together, patterns, precedents, habits, and things get going and they develop a life of their own.
That's certainly right. And then this brings us back to where we started talking about crisis and the growth of government and the work of Robert Higgs, whose excellent classic book in 1987, Crisis and Leviathan, which of course the Independent Institute published, gets at this. And Bob Higgs lays out what he calls the ratchet effect. And it very much is in line with what you just laid out very well, which is you get a crisis situation, you get calls for government to do something, government does something, it expands in size. And it's not just, the size here is not just monetary expenditures or what we might call the scale of the state, but also the scope of the state, the range of activities that the state is kind of granted, because of course we're in a crisis situation and it's extraordinary times. Then the crisis kind of matures and eventually goes away. But as Robert Higgs points out, I think quite convincingly, it never goes back to its normal pre-crisis level.
Right.
And that can be because of things like you're talking about, things like new bureaucracies or expanded bureaucratic powers, or more importantly, changes in ideology, changes in beliefs between citizens and the state, what the appropriate relationship is.
People get used to thinking certain things are okay.
That's exactly right. And so it gets normalized, it becomes part of their life. So there's that direct effect. But again, what's the long-term effect? Well, if people don't exercise the muscle of freedom, the muscle of self-governance, the muscle of peaceful, voluntary interaction with other fellow citizens, that becomes atrophied over time. And so as it becomes normalized and as people become more reliant on the state, because that's how it's always been now, and that's how it has to be, you lose something, and it's very hard to get that back, and that is concerning for those of us who value freedom, human freedom, but also the foundations of freedom, which is peaceful, voluntary interaction between individuals.
I got a comment from one of our friends joining us through ThinkSpot just now, who says, so much bad has been done for the greater good.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to sum it up. And so,
I mean, I would want to say, in response to that myself, that, I mean, the world is complicated, and sometimes there are really extraordinary threats. And, I don't know, you can actually lay down a very neat principle always to say, never do anything extraordinary because it'll have bad consequences. I think you want to keep it down to a bare minimum when it's really, really extraordinary. And then presumably, if you had to resort to expanded powers in a really severe crisis, you'd want to set out the pattern publicly in advance for how that's going to be rolled back. And I don't say that happened in any of these cases. I don't see it happening today. No one's setting forth an agenda about how these powers are going to be consciously rolled back and how state actors are going to be held accountable for the projected rollback of state power. None of that seems to be happening.
That's right. And what makes it even more complicated is that some things you can't roll back. So you can roll back certain rules, certain regulations, but if you believe that precedent matters for things, then it's hard to roll some of that back. Because again, even if you roll back the formal rules, there's still a precedent for government doing certain things. And future government actors can always say, well, in the past, we did X, Y, and Z, so why can't we do X, Y, and Z now? And so it's a very complicated, difficult situation, but one I think that's important to recognize because it gets at the fact that the costs of government action are oftentimes going to be higher than people realize, because what they're focused on is, to the extent they're focused on it, is kind of monetary outlays and things like that, which are often quite high in themselves, I should mention, but are not the only costs.
We have, of course, a lot of people who are paying careful attention here. So here, I'm getting this one comment. This may be a little provocative, but so it's early 1900s New York City. Cholera is ravaging the city. The experts say, believe the science.
Yeah, and so that's actually a great point, which you and I didn't touch upon. But one of the key insights when you look back, and this should be obvious to anyone that thinks about these things, but if you look back at specific cases, you realize that the science, people talk about like it's always settled, like it's this thing that's on high and it's unchanging, is often incorrect. Now, it might be correct from the perspective of people and the knowledge they possess at that point in time, but as new science and new knowledge comes about, whatever means it comes about, that changes. And so thank you for raising that point, because it really highlights this idea that kind of defaulting to that, because now people use that kind of as a stopping argument.
Oh, yeah, it's end of discussion.
Exactly. If you disagree, or I can just say to you, like, I follow the scientists, as if now I'm putting you in a position where you are unscientific and you are just spouting your opinion. But you realize quickly that there is no the science. It's not some homogenous, God-given doctrine that's infallible and constant. And so that's an excellent point.
Also, you might say that there are sometimes not only competing views within a particular scientific discipline, but also there are different scientific disciplines that bear upon a question. So, for example, epidemiologists know a lot about epidemics, but they don't know a lot about the sort of systematic trade-offs that occur between individual liberty and state power that economic scientists have also discovered.
That's exactly right. And so it's a call for interdisciplinary work and humility.
And humility. Yeah, exactly. Here's another comment that I've gotten. What does this analysis imply about our view of the Swedish solution to the coronavirus pandemic? They seem to have, I guess the point of the question is, they seem to have tried to settle early on a plan whereby they would restrict the most vulnerable populations, not close down their economies as thoroughly as has been done elsewhere. They suffered a lot of early deaths. I guess you might say that the jury is still out on the effectiveness, but it would seem that Sweden's way may be more consistent with the insights to be drawn from this history. Does that seem right to you or not?
I think so. Again, I want to be careful, and you were very careful, so I appreciate that. For a lot of these things, it's hard to draw firm conclusions or
Mhm.
kind of to make. I think one of the issues right now is people, the fancy social science language is external validity. So you see something, and is it valid outside that context? And so they'll see a case somewhere, whether it's within the United States or internationally, and they'll say, well, we should do it like that. And you have to just be careful with that, because conditions vary from place to place. But I think also that's the main takeaway, and that's what I take the person that made the comment. So thank you for raising, which is that you know first of all, Sweden, it's not like they were completely laissez-faire. They didn't just say like everyone just do whatever you want. They still had rules in place on certain margins. Again, as you put it quite well, Graham, it wasn't as severe as other governments imposed, at least in many areas. But nonetheless, kind of where we end up in the paper is that we don't want to come across like we're dismissing infectious disease. Infectious disease is a part of human life. There are what
It's pretty
economists call
horrible.
horrible, and they've been part of human life for since there's been human life. It's not like these things just started 2 years ago, or even a century and a half ago, or what have you. In any case, there's externalities. One of the defining features of an infectious disease is that it can be communicated between individuals, and that makes it difficult because my actions can affect you. So how do you deal with that? One standard solution in economics and in many other social sciences, the state must do it, the government must do it. But again, to our way of thinking, to me and my co-author's way of thinking, that neglects the ability of individuals to devise solutions to context-specific externalities. And what I mean by that is, forget about country level, even at the state level. I'm sitting in Northern Virginia right now, about 13 miles outside Washington, D.C. The problems we face with COVID are different than the problems that are faced in Southern Virginia, about 3 hours away from here. And so
Mhm.
the idea that there's even one single homogeneous set of policies for Virginia that should apply to everyone is far from clear. And I think it even might get more local and nuanced than that. So what my co-authors and I kind of end up with is talking about this idea of having a decentralization, and allowing different people and different interactions between people to figure things out, to adapt, to come up with ways of doing things.
Mhm.
And that in no way rejects things like the potential of wearing masks, of social distancing. It's
Mhm.
that having a one size fits all top down policy forced on everyone, to our way of thinking, is quite problematic, both in terms of its ability to deal with context specific conditions in the here and now, but also in terms of the things you and I are talking about in terms of expansions in state power.
The Swedish question reminded me of a particular phrase in your paper. You refer to the importance of non-state processes of social coordination. And in Sweden, may well be relevant because culturally people have observed that Swedes tend to have a kind of a cultural legacy of being socially cooperative and so forth. Um, Maybe what we might like to see would be communities of people where all the precautions necessary to protect other people from a very dangerous virus would be undertaken because people feel that it's unthinkable not to protect grandma, not because you're going to get punished by the state if you don't do it. So, you and I and your co-authors are certainly not saying, well, so you should breathe heavily on grandma without a mask and stop washing your hands. That's not at all the point. If non-state processes of social coordination, to use your fancy term, just means that people care for one another and get along without being forced to.
That's exactly right. And this is happening right now, even with the state response, or responses by different levels of government in the United States. We just don't pay attention to it because it's not front page news. But if you pay attention to it in your own community, or sometimes it's on page 5 or 10 of the newspaper, you'll find or the local paper or local news, you'll see these wonderful examples of local level community efforts to help other human beings. And they vary greatly. They can be things like delivering food to high risk people, or one of the many consequences of the of COVID, whether it is forced stay-at-home orders or the fact that people are staying at home, is isolation, depression, and so on. So you see these wonderful community groups kind of getting together and visiting people either standing like outside their home and talking to them through the window, or Zooming with them, having a Zoom interaction with them so that they get some human interaction. And all these little things that are happening, and there's many others, they're not picked up. There's no way to measure them. There's no way to say, well, government spent this many trillions of dollars. What did you do? And you add up all these little efforts.
Right.
You have to observe them, but that's what a free society is. It is not a pre-planned, aggregate, homogenous thing that you can just, kind of add up across people. It is creating an environment that empowers and enables individuals to come up with solutions on their own. And I think this point is oftentimes overlooked. And now the response might be, well, you still can have a strong state reaction with this. Possibly. But one of the things that you need to keep in mind is that oftentimes strong state actions crowd out those things, either directly by making them illegal, certain behaviors illegal, or by delineating what people can do, whether you're essential or non-essential, or, as I mentioned earlier, by kind of normalizing government as, or the political instrument, if you will, as the solution to all of our ills, as compared to, well, look, people are in my community are suffering, and I care about people, so I'm going to work with other people. And that can be through churches, that can be through civic organizations, or it can just be, you and your family want to help people, and so you help people.
I would rather not help people myself. I'd rather vote for a mask mandate. Much easier.
Yeah, a lot of people hold that position, unfortunately. But
so we need to bring this to a conclusion here, Chris. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Let me just encourage people to go to our website, independent.org, where you can find this article, Infectious Diseases and Government Growth. It will be released in the Independent Review in the spring 2021 issue, but it's available now because it's so important. And yet at the same time, let me commend you and your co-authors, Dr. Coyne, because this article is not, excuse me, even though it has implications for our current crisis, it's not a bunch of ranting and raving. It's actually research, history, and careful analysis. I think it really contributes to the discussion in a very sensible and needed way. So thank you and your co-authors very much.
Well, thank you. And thank you again for having me on to talk with you today. It's been a pleasure.
It's a pleasure. And we thank all those who joined us today for this conversation, coming to you from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. Visit us on our website. We got a lot of resources that you can use for this and other kinds of public issues. And come back next time. Take care.